There is a moment, just after the bombs stop falling, when the silence weighs more than the rubble. February 1945. The Battle of Manila has ended, but the city is not quiet. It breathes in pain, like an animal too wounded to cry out. Charred stone churches lean sideways. Smoke still curls from rooftops that once held piano rooms and tea sets. Somewhere, a phonograph lies cracked in a pool of water and ash. Its last song drowned mid-note. In the heart of this scorched city, inside the remains of a commandeered Jesuit school turned U.S. field detention site, a different kind of silence hangs, heavier, older. The silence between enemies who no longer have the strength to hate out loud. Among the American personnel assigned to oversee civilian prisoners of the Japanese Empire, administrators, clerks, nurses, translators, was Corporal Margaret Walsh, a 26-year-old Army nurse's aide from Iowa. She had strawberry-colored hair usually tucked into a bun. Her boots were too big. Her laugh, back home, used to carry across cornfields. But here, in the shadows of ruined Manila, she hadn't laughed in weeks. Margaret wasn't sent to guard prisoners. She came to count morphine bottles, tend to the sick, and stir powdered eggs in the communal mess. But war, in its cruel arithmetic, blurs titles. And one evening, as dusk pushed pale light through the broken windows of the camp kitchen, Margaret found herself standing across from 3 Japanese women she'd never expected to meet. They were not nurses, not civilians in the Western sense. According to the reports, they had managed so-called comfort stations, brothels, supplied and staffed by the Japanese military across the Pacific. These 3 women, one from Osaka, one from Shizuoka, and one from Busan, Korea, had been captured in the outskirts of Manila after the imperial withdrawal. Now, they wore ill-fitting clothes and blank expressions. One of them, the eldest, Sayeko from Osaka, had sharp cheekbones and hands that wouldn't stop trembling. When she first entered the kitchen, she muttered in Japanese, something about foreign filth, assuming none would understand. Margaret understood enough to know it wasn't friendly. Margaret had been assigned to oversee rations that day, just a minor task, ladling out soup to the wounded and organizing the bread deliveries. She watched as the women stood stiff in the doorway, unsure whether to enter. The American guards didn't look at them. They didn't say a word, just pointed toward the back of the room, where a griddle sat cold beside a box of canned butter and white bread. The Army had decided the prisoners could earn their meals by helping with prep. It wasn't punishment. Not officially. But nobody said it out loud, that these women had been on the other side of pain. The air in the kitchen was thick with humidity and old grease. The building had no windows left intact. Light filtered through sheets of tarp and broken glass, casting shadows across the tiled floor like stained glass ghosts. Margaret broke the silence first. She unwrapped a loaf of bread and held it out. "Here," she said quietly. "We're making grilled cheese." Saiko looked at her translator, a Nisei linguist from California named Arthur, and scoffed. "Melted fat?" she asked in Japanese. "That's not food. That's how you grease wagon wheels." The other 2 women chuckled. A bitter sound, almost theatrical. Margaret didn't answer. She just took a slice of the American cheese, a stiff, orange square that barely resembled dairy, and laid it between 2 pieces of bread. She turned on the griddle. Waited. Outside, the wind whispered through the bones of a burned seminary. Crows had returned. Somewhere nearby, a child cried for her mother, not knowing which ruin she was buried under. Then came the scent. The crackle of bread, meeting butter, the slow browning. The scent of comfort in a city that had forgotten what comfort was. Seiko sniffed, frowned, looked away. But the other 2 leaned forward, drawn by something older than politics. Hunger. memory. Something in the sizzle reminded them of a street cart back home, of warmth. Margaret slid the sandwich onto a plate. No ceremony, just placed it there and stepped back. The three women stared. One, the youngest, Minji, the Korean, picked it up. Tentative. She bit, chewed, and for a moment, the briefest, her eyes widened. She handed it to the others, and something shifted. No one smiled. No one cried, but the air grew softer. In the weeks that followed, the kitchen became something more than a workspace. It became neutral ground. Not a courtroom, not a barracks, just a kitchen. Where former comfort women, former administrators, nurses, and soldiers stood side by side, making meals none of them had grown up with. Each grilled cheese was imperfect. Sometimes the butter burned. Sometimes the cheese didn't melt. But no one complained. Because each sandwich was a bridge, brittle, flawed, but real. And sometimes, when Margaret stood alone at the sink, washing pans with scalding water, she would whisper to herself, maybe this is what peace tastes like. She never told anyone what she meant. Only the griddle knew. But the griddle, like all things touched by war, carried its own memories. It had once been part of a missionary seminary's outdoor kitchen. A thick, cast-iron slab bolted onto a cracked cement hearth. Before the war, Filipino nuns had used it to prepare porridge for orphans, girls who danced barefoot on the tiles, girls who thought the world could be kind. But fire erased those footsteps. Shells cracked the roof open, and now the griddle sat among ghosts, resurrected for a purpose it didn't understand. In the early mornings, before the prisoners arrived, Corporal Margaret Walsh would light the stove beneath it, slowly, methodically, like a ritual. The soft click of the flint wheel, the rising blue flame. It reminded her of home in ways she could never explain. Her brother Jimmy used to toast bread on a coal shovel during winters in Iowa. He was dead now. His B-24 went down near Formosa. But somehow, the smell of bread in Manila kept his memory warm. By week's end, the kitchen had gathered a rhythm. The Japanese women came in pairs, no longer under guard, but always watched. Their uniforms, once stolen from abandoned Red Cross crates, were faded, ill-fitting. Their sleeves were rolled high, their faces sunken. But their hands had learned the movements. Butter, bread, press, flip. Sometimes Margaret would give quiet instruction, gesturing with her fingers, her words softened by Arthur, the Nisei interpreter with a face too young for his eyes. He never spoke unless asked. When he did, his voice came low, respectful, like water poured over stone. The oddest thing was not that they cooked together. It was that they said so little. The silence between Margaret and the women wasn't hostile anymore. It was sacred, as if words might break something fragile growing between them. And yet, it hung heavy. Because underneath the quiet, memory boiled. One afternoon, the youngest woman, Minji, burned her palm on the griddle's edge. She cried out, just a small, startled sound. And Margaret rushed forward with the instinct of any nurse. She grabbed the girl's wrist, ran cool water over it, cradled the injury like a mother would. Their eyes met, and that's when Margaret saw it. Not pain, but shame. Deep, historical, inherited shame. Minji looked away, lips trembling. Arthur hesitated. Then, in a voice barely audible, he translated her whisper. She says, "You shouldn't touch her. She's not clean." Margaret's hands froze. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Then she took the bar of soap from the sink, a brown, crumbling wedge of army-issue lye, and placed it in Minji's good hand. She pointed to the tap. "Clean is something we choose," she said. Arthur hesitated, then spoke the words. Minji stared at the soap. then at Margaret, then nodded once, slowly, like a child learning a new word. After that day, something shifted again. They began to speak, not much, not about the war, but about flavors, ingredients, memories of meals before everything burned. One woman asked what the orange square in the sandwich was made of. Margaret laughed for the first time in weeks. "It's not cheese," she said. "It's a lie wrapped in plastic." Psycho smirked. "Ah, like an officer." Even Arthur laughed, but not all shadows left the room. In the evenings, once the griddle cooled and the prisoners returned to their barracks, Margaret would linger behind to scrub the stove. Sometimes she was joined by Sister Alma, a Filipino nun who had survived the shelling by hiding in the catacombs beneath the ruined seminary. Sister Alma didn't speak much either. She just helped wipe down surfaces, her habit patched and soot-streaked. One night, Sister Alma said, "You know who they are, don't you?" Margaret nodded. She had read the files. Comfort station administrators, meaning, by military logic, facilitators of rape. But war doesn't obey courtroom logic. Not here, not now. "I know what they were," Margaret whispered. "But I don't know what they are now." The nun looked at her. Her eyes were like wells too deep to reflect light. "Maybe that's the point," she said. "Maybe you're helping them remember." That thought haunted Margaret. She had seen women like Minji before, at Santo Tomas, where American and Filipino civilians had been held by the Japanese for years. Starving, hollowed women. And now, here they were, standing over a griddle with the other side. It wasn't justice. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something stranger. One afternoon, Margaret found Psycho sitting alone by the back wall. She wasn't cooking, just staring at the cement floor. When Margaret approached, Psycho spoke in broken English. "Before war, I was schoolteacher," she said. "Third grade, Osaka. I like snow." Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to, because somewhere, deep beneath uniforms and barbed wire, beyond flags and ideologies, the embers of humanity still glowed. Faint, but real. Snow, Iowa, Osaka. Bread, shame, cheese, all melted together, like grease on a griddle. But some stains do not lift. Not with water, not with soap, not even with time. Each night, the griddle was wiped clean. And yet, each morning, Margaret saw the same thing when she bent down to light the stove. A small, dark patch of scorched grease near the back left corner. It wouldn't scrub off. It remained, like a bruise no salve could touch. She began to call it the shadow. And as February wore on, so did the shadow inside the women. The war had not ended for them. It had only shifted shape. Though now fed, now warm, now allowed to breathe without fear of the rifle's butt. They carried inside them the heavy arithmetic of complicity. And Margaret, though she had never said so aloud, began to feel it. That unspoken tension not just between captor and captive, but between woman and woman. Between those who'd survived a man's war by obeying it, and those who had resisted it by healing what it broke. One morning, as dawn cracked like tired knuckles over the Manila skyline, Margaret arrived early to prepare rations. Sister Alma was already there, standing by the open door. She held a small paper bundle, tied with twine, spotted with grease. "It was on the chapel steps," she said, handing it to Margaret. "No note, but I think it's for you." Inside, wrapped in salvaged newspaper, was a sandwich. Clumsily made, slightly burned at the edges. A grilled cheese. American style? One of theirs. Margaret stood still, the bundle warming her palms. No signature, no bow. Just the simple act of reversal. That day, when the women entered the kitchen, no one spoke of it. But their glances lingered longer. Their hands moved slower, as if a secret had passed between them. A meal, unspoken, as apology. But war rarely grants the luxury of clean lines. That same afternoon, a new group of detainees arrived. Survivors pulled from a collapsed structure near the river. Among them were two Korean women, thin, injured, eyes hollow, who'd been used by the very comfort station Psycho had once administered. One woman, her name listed as Yoon-hee, had deep scarring across her back, bayonet wounds, partially healed. When the field nurse undressed her to clean the tissue, even the army medics looked away, and fate, with its cruel sense of irony, placed her in the same ward as Psycho. Margaret only learned of it when she brought lunch trays that evening. Psycho was seated quietly by the window, her food untouched. Yoon-hee lay in the adjacent cot, her hands gripping the mattress edge as if trying to stay inside her body. Neither spoke. Margaret set the tray down on a small crate between them. "Bread, cheese, water. Eat while it's warm," she said softly, but her voice was dust, the air dry, cracking. And as she turned to leave, she heard it. Not a voice, not even a cry. Just a breath, sharp and ragged. Sayeko had lowered her head. "I didn't know," she whispered. Yoon-hee did not respond. "I managed," Psycho said again, but her voice cracked. Margaret froze in the doorway. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't a confession. It was something stranger. The sound of ideology peeling off like skin from a burn. Margaret didn't speak. She let the silence breathe. Then quietly, without looking back, she stepped out into the courtyard, where the rain had just begun to fall. It was a soft rain. Manila rain. Not loud, not angry. Just enough to darken the dust and bring out the scent of soil and stone. That night, the griddle remained cold. Margaret sat beside it, alone, cleaning it with slow circular motions, not to scrub it, but to be near it, to feel the smooth surface beneath her hand. She thought of Yoon-hee's back, of Seiko's silence, of the sandwich on the chapel step, and suddenly she realized. The kitchen was no longer a neutral space. It had become a confessional, not of words, of gestures, small things, a crust not eaten, a sandwich folded carefully, the choice to stay in a room when every part of you wants to flee. This was no courtroom, no tribunal, no war crimes roster, but somehow it mattered more. Because here in the heat and oil, among butter knives and ration tins, the women were forced to meet each other, not as enemies, but as mirrors. Some mirrors cracked, some too clouded to see through, but others began to reflect flickers of something human. Not forgiveness. That was too large, too sharp-edged. Just recognition. The oil on the griddle never came clean. Neither did the past. But when Margaret washed her hands that night, the soap lathered quickly, thick and white, fragrant and pure, and that somehow was enough. But silence has its limits. A week passed. The Manila heat returned, thick and unmoving, like wet gauze laid across a wound. The monsoon rains had retreated, and with their absence came the flies, the smell of mold in canvas tents, and the noise, trucks backfiring, boots scraping, the groan of iron being bent straight again by American engineers. Yet inside the kitchen, a quieter shift was taking place. One not marked by sound, but by gesture. The women no longer stood apart while preparing meals. They began to move around one another. Not comfortably, no, but with care. There was a rhythm forming. Butter down, bread laid, cheese centered, flip timed by instinct. And in that rhythm, something strange began to happen. They started anticipating each other. Hands reached for utensils before they were asked. Pans were cleaned without request. Even the act of passing a plate was done gently, as if to say, "I see you, even if I don't understand you." For Margaret, it was like watching fog lift in a ruined orchard. You couldn't plant anything yet, not really. But the air smelled cleaner. Then, without warning, Arthur, the Nisei interpreter, was reassigned. Orders came down. He was needed at a tribunal being organized elsewhere, where the language of war crimes demanded sharper words and tighter definitions. When he left, the kitchen felt emptier than anyone expected. His absence revealed something essential. They had built this fragile, wordless community through his quiet presence. Now the bridge was gone. At first, no one knew how to speak. Margaret tried writing out phrases. She sketched a grilled cheese sandwich on a scrap of ration box, labeled each part in English. Saiko corrected it with kanji. Minji added Hangul beside it. They laughed, quietly, at how different the characters looked for the same thing. And so, without Arthur, they invented a new language. It was made of nods, of fingers tapped twice on a table, of shoulders turned slightly to signal, "Go ahead," of burnt sandwiches held up in mock accusation, of eyes widening at the first bubbling hiss of butter hitting metal. One day, Saiko made a sandwich with 2 slices of bread and no cheese, then placed a clean leaf of wild basil inside it, torn from the seminary garden. She handed it to Margaret with a single phrase in broken English. "Still good." Margaret took a bite, smiled. Later, she wrote in her journal, "Somehow it felt like poetry. Food speaking where words fail. I wonder if grief tastes the same in every language." But not all things could be softened by food. Every few days, Sister Alma received new civilian detainees from the outskirts of the city. Japanese nurses who had surrendered, Filipino women displaced by the fighting, even a few Korean survivors of the Japanese retreat. And with each arrival came new histories, new wounds. One afternoon, a new prisoner named Aiko was brought into the camp. She was different from the others. Hard-eyed, bone-thin, uniform torn at the shoulder. She had been captured while attempting to escape a Japanese field hospital where she had worked not as a medic, but as a recorder. Her job, it was said, had been to document the recovery rates of wounded Japanese soldiers and the expendability of Korean comfort women once they were deemed no longer useful. Aiko didn't enter the kitchen as a helper. She entered because Sister Alma said she needed labor. Her first words to Margaret were curt. "I won't cook American food. It's lies on toast." The other women said nothing. But when Saiko handed her a grilled cheese on the second day, plain, warm, neatly cut, Aiko slapped it from her hand. Crumbs scattered across the tile like ash. The silence in the kitchen turned solid, heavy, sharp. Margaret didn't shout, didn't react. She knelt, gathered the pieces, placed them in the waste pail, one by one, as if collecting bones. Aiko stood above her, unmoving. Then Minji, who had once burned her hand, who had once refused to be touched, stepped forward. She took a new sandwich from the pan, held it out, and said softly, "Eat." Her voice cracked. The English was imperfect, but clear. Aiko looked at her, really looked, and something flickered in her face. Not acceptance, not remorse, just recognition that Minji, like her, had seen too much, had swallowed too much silence, had worn shame like a second skin. She took the sandwich, did not eat, but held it. And that was something. That night, the griddle sizzled longer than usual. The women stayed late, cooking for no one, practicing, experimenting, layering bits of tinned pineapple or canned fish into the bread, laughing softly when it failed, saying nothing when it worked. Margaret wrote no entry that night. She just watched the steam rise off the pan, the light catching it like incense in a shattered chapel. She understood something then. Words were weapons during war, but after war, sometimes, the only thing strong enough to hold truth was heat, bread, and silence. But sometimes silence needs steam to speak. The Manila sun returned with a vengeance that week. It baked the camp's tin roofs until the air shimmered, until boots stuck slightly to the concrete, until even the shadows looked thirsty. The smell of rust and boiled starch clung to every cloth surface. Uniforms, bandages, even the damp pillowcases stacked in the infirmary. That's when the water line broke. Not the clean line from the field pump, but the auxiliary one. The line that fed the washroom behind the chapel, where the female detainees went to scrub laundry, rinse rice, and sometimes, in secrecy, rinse themselves. It was Margaret who discovered the burst, her canvas shoes sloshing through a thin sheet of water as she opened the door one morning. Inside, steam curled upward from a cracked pipe near the floor, hissing gently like a kettle about to confess something. She stepped back, not because of danger, but because of the heat, and because, in that moment, something else struck her. The sound of singing, soft, wordless, like a lullaby hummed by someone who had forgotten the tune but not the feeling. There, kneeling beside the leak, sleeves rolled and face flushed, was Minji. Her bare arms shimmered with sweat. A rag soaked in vinegar water was tied around her forehead. She was laughing, quietly, as if something inside had uncoiled, a knot, a memory, and the steam had drawn it out. Margaret didn't interrupt. She just leaned against the doorway and watched. After a moment, Minji saw her, smiled, and gestured, one hand waving, the other pointing at the leak with mock accusation. "Angry pipe," she said in English. Margaret smiled back. That afternoon, the Army engineers fixed the line. But something remained. A memory of warmth, not from food, but from water. Cleansing water. Restorative water. And so Sister Alma made a request. She asked for permission, just once a week, for the women to use the camp's portable field shower. A crude system made of sandbags and canvas and an overhead barrel warmed by fire, originally meant for Army medics. Now, for this, something else. It wasn't granted easily. The war was still burning in the north. General MacArthur's men were clearing Luzon ridge by ridge. Trust was thin. Orders were blunt, but somehow, the approval came. Maybe someone in command had read Margaret's field notes. Maybe someone just got tired of saying no. The first shower day arrived without ceremony. 6 women stepped into the canvas enclosure one by one. Korean and Japanese, administrator and survivor, friend and stranger. They each carried a small bar of soap and a towel. Nothing else. No uniforms, no weapons, no masks. Margaret stood outside, arms crossed, listening to the sound of water striking skin and wood and silence. They didn't talk, not at first. But then, through the canvas, came a laugh. Not cruel, not bitter, just startled, like a child discovering warm rain for the first time. Later, Margaret would write, "There are few sounds more sacred than a woman laughing in water she did not have to beg for." When the women emerged, their faces were changed, not cleaned, not forgiven, but softened. Psycho's hair clung to her neck in gray-black strands. Her eyes, always sharp, now seemed older, but not harder. She nodded at Margaret, not in deference, but in shared breath. Even Aiko, still scowling, walked a little slower, as if something within her had cooled or perhaps melted. And as they returned to the kitchen, still damp, still quiet, Margaret noticed something else. They stood closer now, not touching, but not avoiding. And during lunch prep, Minji reached over, unprompted, and gently turned Aiko's sandwich with her own spatula to keep it from burning. A moment, a flick of the wrist, and yet it changed the room. From then on, the field shower became a ritual. Each Sunday, Sister Alma would light the fire beneath the barrel, and Margaret would lay out small cloth towels, soap chips, and sometimes, when rations allowed, a few drops of lavender oil swiped from a medic's satchel. The women never rushed. They waited for one another. It was never about hygiene. It was baptism. The kind without a name. The kind that had nothing to do with redemption, and everything to do with beginning again. One afternoon, while cleaning the griddle, Margaret overheard a quiet conversation between Seiko and Minji, in Japanese, then Korean, then fragments of English. She couldn't understand all of it, but she caught one phrase: before the uniform. Not during, not after, before. And that, more than any tribunal, any document, any confession, held the truth of their journey. These women, once enemies, once unknowns, were learning to speak in a language older than power, the language of before flags, before orders, before shame had a uniform. And as the sandwiches sizzled that evening, Margaret wrote just one line on a torn scrap of parchment and tucked it behind the spice tin. Heat softens metal, but steam softens the soul. But even softened souls can be shattered by paper. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded twice, edges frayed from a long journey. The ink was smudged, and the handwriting, careful, almost trembling, belonged to a Filipino interpreter assigned to Camp Nichols. It had been forwarded twice. No one claimed it. No one wanted it. It was addressed in cautious English to a woman named Saiko Nakamura, with no rank, no title, just a name. Beneath it, previously of Osaka, former administrator, Luzon. Sister Alma brought it into the kitchen. She didn't say much, just placed it quietly near the sugar tin on the back counter, beside the butter knives and canned milk. Then she left. The air changed. The women said nothing, but their eyes kept returning to the folded paper like it might ignite by itself. Saeko didn't touch it. Not at first. She worked through the meal prep with more focus than usual, slicing bread with clean, precise movements, as if trying to carve her way back to a different time. It wasn't until Margaret had finished wiping down the griddle that Saiko approached the letter, slowly, like approaching a grave that might speak back. She opened it with careful fingers. Margaret didn't watch. She only heard the breath catch in Seiko's throat, barely audible, a sound like glass under snow. The letter was short, 2 paragraphs, translated from Tagalog. It had been written by the daughter of a woman who had vanished near Lingayen Gulf in 1943. The writer didn't accuse. She didn't plead. She only asked, "Did my mother pass through your station?" Her name was Lilia. She had a scar across her left cheek and always sang when nervous. I was 6 when she was taken. There was no threat, no demand for justice, just a daughter, now grown, asking into the silence. Saiko folded the letter, then folded again and again, until the paper was small enough to disappear inside her palm. She stood motionless for a long time. That night, she did not eat. The next morning, she arrived early, before the others, before the fire under the griddle had been lit. Margaret was already there, seated by the window, peeling potatoes for the midday stew. She looked up, saw the face of a woman who had not slept. Saiko held the folded letter out, not to give it, but to show it. "I remember," she said. Her song, she hummed when sweeping. Her voice cracked. Then more softly, "I remember," not stopping it. She didn't cry. She just turned and left the kitchen, leaving behind the letter and a silence too heavy to breathe. That day the women cooked in near silence. Even Minji, usually the first to joke about burnt bread, kept her eyes on the flame, turning sandwiches with mechanical precision. It was Aiko who finally broke the silence, not with words, but with motion. She reached across the table and picked up the letter, unfolded it, read it aloud, line by line, in halting English. Then she folded it again, once, and passed it to Minji. Minji didn't read, she just held it. Then, in a gesture that no one expected, she reached into the ration bin and pulled out a square of wax paper. She wrapped the letter inside it, gently, like preserving something sacred. When she was done, she handed it to Margaret. For you, she said. Keep. Margaret didn't ask why. She just took it and tucked it into the small wooden box where she kept measuring spoons and ribbon from home. That night, she wrote, "The war leaves no room for closure. Only the shape of the hole where someone once sang." The letter changed something. Not dramatically, not loudly. But afterward, the kitchen felt like a shrine. Not to guilt, but to memory. Each sandwich made in that space now carried weight. It wasn't just bread and cheese anymore. It was bread and grief, cheese and questions, butter and unspoken names. They began marking the grilled sandwiches with notches, small diagonal cuts across the top crust. Margaret noticed first. 1 cut, 2 cuts, sometimes 3. At first, she thought it was just habit, a cooking technique. Then she realized they were counting, not days, names. Names they remembered. Or names they never knew, but couldn't forget. Psycho never spoke of the letter again, but once. When the evening meal was over and the oil had cooled, she asked Margaret in quiet English, "Does your brother have a grave?" Margaret paused. "No," she said, "just sky and water." Psycho nodded, then whispered, "That is still a grave." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the first time they had spoken of the dead. Not as enemies, not as war dead, but as ours. Shared, unfinished. And the steam that rose from the griddle that night seemed different. Thicker, almost holy. The bread browned evenly, the cheese melted just right. And no one, not even Aiko, burned anything. But even softened souls can be shattered by paper. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Folded twice, edges frayed from a long journey. The ink was smudged, and the handwriting, careful, almost trembling, belonged to a Filipino interpreter assigned to Camp Nichols. It had been forwarded twice. No one claimed it. No one wanted it. It was addressed in cautious English to a woman named Seiko Nakamura, with no rank, no title, just a name. Beneath it, previously of Osaka, former administrator Luzon. Sister Alma brought it into the kitchen. She didn't say much, just placed it quietly near the sugar tin on the back counter, beside the butter knives and canned milk. Then she left. The air changed. The women said nothing, but their eyes kept returning to the folded paper like it might ignite by itself. Psycho didn't touch it. Not at first. She worked through the meal prep with more focus than usual, slicing bread with clean, precise movements, as if trying to carve her way back to a different time. It wasn't until Margaret had finished wiping down the griddle that Seiko approached the letter. Slowly, like approaching a grave that might speak back. She opened it with careful fingers. Margaret didn't watch. She only heard the breath catch in Psycho's throat, barely audible. A sound like glass under snow. The letter was short. 2 paragraphs, translated from Tagalog. It had been written by the daughter of a woman who had vanished near Lingayen Gulf in 1943. The writer didn't accuse. She didn't plead. She only asked, "Did my mother pass through your station?" Her name was Lilia. She had a scar across her left cheek and always sang when nervous. I was 6 when she was taken. There was no threat, no demand for justice. Just a daughter, now grown, asking into the silence. Saeko folded the letter, then folded again and again, until the paper was small enough to disappear inside her palm. She stood motionless for a long time. That night, she did not eat. The next morning, she arrived early, before the others, before the fire under the griddle had been lit. Margaret was already there, seated by the window, peeling potatoes for the midday stew. She looked up, saw the face of a woman who had not slept. Saeko held the folded letter out, not to give it, but to show it. "I remember," she said. Her song, she hummed when sweeping. Her voice cracked. Then more softly, "I remember," not stopping it. She didn't cry, She just turned and left the kitchen, leaving behind the letter and a silence too heavy to breathe. That day, the women cooked in near silence. Even Minji, usually the first to joke about burnt bread, kept her eyes on the flame, turning sandwiches with mechanical precision. It was Aiko who finally broke the silence, not with words, but with motion. She reached across the table and picked up the letter, unfolded it, read it aloud, line by line, in halting English. Then she folded it again, once, and passed it to Minji. Minji didn't read. She just held it. Then, in a gesture that no one expected, she reached into the ration bin and pulled out a square of wax paper. She wrapped the letter inside it, gently, like preserving something sacred. When she was done, she handed it to Margaret. "For you," she said. "Keep." Margaret didn't ask why. She just took it and tucked it into the small wooden box where she kept measuring spoons and ribbon from home. That night, she wrote, "The war leaves no room for closure, only the shape of the hole where someone once sang." The letter changed something, not dramatically, not loudly, but afterward, the kitchen felt like a shrine. Not to guilt, but to memory. Each sandwich made in that space now carried weight. It wasn't just bread and cheese anymore. It was bread and grief, cheese and questions, butter and unspoken names. They began marking the grilled sandwiches with notches, small diagonal cuts across the top crust. Margaret noticed first. 1 cut, 2 cuts, sometimes 3. At first, she thought it was just habit, a cooking technique. Then she realized they were counting, not days. Names. Names they remembered. Or names they never knew but couldn't forget. Saiko never spoke of the letter again. But once, when the evening meal was over and the oil had cooled, she asked Margaret in quiet English, "Does your brother have a grave?" Margaret paused. "No," she said, "just sky and water." Saiko nodded, then whispered, "That is still a grave." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the first time they had spoken of the dead. Not as enemies, not as war dead, but as ours. Shared, unfinished. And the steam that rose from the griddle that night seemed different. Thicker, almost holy. The bread browned evenly. The cheese melted just right. And no one, not even Aiko, burned anything. That night, something changed in the rhythm of the camp. It wasn't in the orders. Those remained clipped and cold. It wasn't in the food. The same powdered eggs, the same brittle bread, the same canned orange cheese. It was in how the women began to linger. After meals, after cleanup, after the griddle had cooled and the final tin pail had been rinsed, they stayed, seated on overturned crates or resting against the kitchen's broken stone wall. No one said they had to. No one told them they could. They just remained. And it was there, amid stacked flour sacks and grease-smudged ration tins, that the past began to surface. Not like a confession, but like a song hummed under breath. Minji was the first. She spoke quietly, brushing crumbs off her lap as she looked into the low flame of the kerosene lamp. "I was supposed to be a dancer," she said in Korean-accented English. Aiko scoffed softly. "We were all supposed to be something." Minji didn't react. She just kept speaking. "My mother taught me. Every night after supper, in the back room, we'd move the furniture and put on her old records. She said if I could learn the fan dance without looking down, I'd never have to bow to a man." She smiled faintly. I failed, of course. Saiko said nothing. But her hands, folded in her lap, were trembling. Margaret sat nearby, pretending to stir a pot that no longer needed stirring. The room had grown still, as if waiting for breath. Aiko leaned back against the cracked pillar, her voice flat. "I had a piano in Nagasaki. My father hated noise, so I played quietly. Chopin, sometimes ragtime." She shrugged. "It's probably ash now." Then she added almost inaudibly, "I still move my fingers when I sleep, like they remember the keys." There was silence, but not the old silence, not the fearful, brittle one from weeks before. This one felt soft, wide, like an open door no one wanted to close. Then Saeko, always the proudest, always the one who rarely met Margaret's eyes, spoke. My husband died in China, 1939. He was a quartermaster. She stared at the floor. I believed in the empire then. I believed we were bringing order, that our duty mattered, that we were different than the Europeans. Her voice didn't crack, but her posture did. I managed a comfort station because I thought it was necessary. Because I thought if I didn't, someone worse would. She looked up finally and met Margaret's eyes, but it still broke them, one by one. Girls who were children in the morning and not by nightfall. Margaret didn't move. Saeko continued. I told myself I was saving them from beatings, from disease, that I made their lives more bearable. She looked at her hands, dry, lined, burnt slightly at the knuckles from the griddle. But I still wrote down their names, their times, their injuries, and then handed the paper to a man with clean boots. No one said anything, because what could be said? This was not confession. This was remembering aloud, the oldest form of truth. Sister Alma arrived late that evening, as always, carrying a tin cup of boiled barley tea. She sat beside the door and listened, not as a nun, not as a judge, just as another woman who had survived the war in a body that still ached from remembering. She said only this: sin is not what you did when you were powerless. Sin is what you keep defending when you finally have a choice. Then she stood, bowed slightly, and left. Margaret looked at the women, 5 of them now, seated quietly in the half-light of a Manila night where the bombs had stopped falling, but the echoes still rang. And in that moment, she saw something impossible. They were beginning to live again, not proudly, not without pain, but with intention, like people returning from an avalanche, brushing off the snow, counting fingers, checking if the heart still beats. That night, before bed, Margaret opened the box where she kept her brother's last letter. Still folded, still unread. He had written it 2 weeks before his bomber went down. She had never opened it, because she didn't want the war to end in ink. But now she did. Inside, he wrote only 3 sentences. We fly again tomorrow. The clouds were beautiful today. I hope the world still has bread and butter when we're done with this mess. She cried, but quietly, because some grief doesn't demand tears. It just waits for them to arrive like steam over warm bread. The next morning, Margaret added something new to the kitchen routine. A notebook, blank pages, no rules, just a place where the women could write their names, their memories, their recipes, their stories of before. She placed it near the salt tin, next to the folded letter of the woman asking about her missing mother. Minji wrote first, then Aiko. Saeko waited until the end of the day. She didn't write her name, only one line. I want to remember something that has no uniform. But uniforms always return, even after the guns go silent, even after the letters have been read, even after the sandwiches have been shared. They return, pressed, creased, immaculate, with medals that shine but never speak of blood. It was late March when they came. 3 jeeps rolled into the edge of the civilian detention compound. Dust trailed behind them like ghosts reluctant to leave. The men who stepped out weren't cruel. They weren't armed, but they were precise. U.S. Army Intelligence, War Crimes Division. They came with clipboards, with interpreter officers, with quiet eyes trained to separate lies from trauma. Their job was not to listen, it was to record. Margaret saw them from the chapel steps. She had just finished boiling linen for the infirmary when she noticed the change in the air. Not noise, but tension, the kind that made even the crows fly wide. By mid-morning, every woman with a past tied to a comfort station, administrative or otherwise, had been called to a small canvas interview tent. Minji looked at the summons with her hands trembling. Saeko folded hers into her apron. Aiko, ever defiant, tore hers in half, but still walked to the tent. Because war teaches you one thing above all. You don't run, you endure. Margaret asked to attend. They said no. Sister Alma asked to translate. They said no. Arthur, the Nisei interpreter, had returned briefly for the sessions. His face was harder now, less boyish. The Manila sun had drawn lines at his temples. He nodded at Margaret as he passed her in the corridor. "This isn't about listening," he said quietly. "This is about sorting." She understood. Inside the kitchen, the griddle stayed cold that day. No one cooked, no sandwiches, no conversation. Just the echo of metal trays being stacked and unstacked, as if the kitchen itself didn't know what to do without heat. It was hours before the women returned. They didn't speak. Minji's eyes were red, not from crying, but from holding breath too long. Aiko looked the same, but her hands were clenched at her sides, fingernails half-mooned into skin. Saiko walked differently, not slower, just heavier. Margaret didn't ask what was said. Instead, she lit the stove. She laid out the bread, one slice at a time, buttered each gently, waited for the sizzle. Then, without a word, she handed each woman a sandwich. They sat at the long prep table, eating in silence, chewing not just food, but memory. After a long while, Saiko whispered, "They asked if I remembered names." No one responded. "They asked if I remembered orders, directives, ledgers, anything proving chain of command." She stared at her sandwich. "I told them I remembered a girl who used to braid her hair in silence, every morning, before they made her sing." Her voice faltered. "They didn't write that down." Minji murmured. "They asked if I was recruited or taken." She paused. "I didn't know which answer made me cleaner." Margaret felt the air shift again, like a wound reopening. "I told them I scrubbed floors," Minji said. "That I made tea, that I saw things I didn't stop. And they asked why I didn't stop them." Her voice broke. "As if I could." The bread in her hands had gone limp from her grip. Aiko laughed once, bitterly. "They asked if I regretted." She looked at the ceiling, as if trying to remember the sky. "I asked them what good regret does in a tent full of ghosts." Silence. Then Sister Alma spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "They were not asking you for truth." Everyone turned. "They were asking you to fit inside the report." She stepped into the kitchen, carrying a basin of clean linen. "They came not to see if you had changed, but to see if you could be measured." Margaret stood very still. Outside, the wind began to pick up. Manila's dry season wind, full of dust and half-promises. That night, Margaret opened the ledger the Army required her to keep. Food portions, supplies, names of workers. She turned to the back, and there, in the empty margins, she began writing down the names the women had whispered in passing. Not prisoners, not victims, not perpetrators. Just names. Names without uniforms. She left no dates, only the food they liked. The songs they once hummed. The way one of them cut her sandwich diagonally because it reminded her of her mother's tea house in Busan. And she wondered, what if that's how we recorded history? Not by verdicts, but by the way someone stirred soup without being asked. By the way steam carried forgiveness farther than any flag. And the next morning, when she opened the kitchen early, Saiko was already there, waiting. No apron, no clipboard. Just holding a stick of butter in one hand and the blank recipe notebook in the other. "Today," she said softly, "we write down how to make it golden, not just hot." Margaret nodded, and for the first time in weeks, the griddle hissed before the sun rose. It began with butter, always butter. Saiko melted it slowly, watching the golden foam rise like breath from the pan. She tilted it slightly, just enough to swirl, not scorch. Across the room, Minji measured flour with a teaspoon, leveling it carefully with the dull edge of a spoon. Aiko, silent as ever, unwrapped the powdered milk ration, her fingers moving as if muscle memory had replaced thought. It was the same kitchen. Same griddle. Same battered spice tin. Same dent in the fourth tile from the window. But this morning felt different. The air was full of intent. Not duty, not survival, but something older. They were no longer just making food. They were making memory with purpose. On the counter lay the notebook. Spine cracked, pages softened by steam and grease. It had once been blank. Now it was filled with handwriting from 3 languages: Korean, Japanese, English, overlapping, crowding each other, like voices finally daring to speak at once. The first page held no names, only this: recipes are not only for hunger, they are for remembering who we were when we still had a face. The page below it held the first shared creation, a variation of the grilled cheese sandwich. It read, bread, soft but not crumbling. Butter, more than you think. Cheese, if real, is a luxury, if not pretend. Press gently, like you're trying not to break it. Serve warm, never alone. Best shared in silence or with tears. They wrote it half-jokingly, but it stuck. That morning, Sister Alma came early. She stepped into the kitchen, saw the griddle already warm, and paused, not from surprise, but reverence. She said nothing at first, just took a seat at the edge of the room and watched. Then Psycho offered her a plate, 2 sandwiches, cut diagonally. Sister Alma accepted. She took 1 bite, then closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she whispered, "I had this once, before the bombs, in a house with yellow walls and a radio." She smiled faintly. I was 12. I wore my brother's shoes because mine had holes. She laughed softly, more breath than sound. "Thank you for bringing me back there." Minji turned a page in the notebook and began writing again. This time not a recipe, but a memory. Just a list. First snow on a tin roof in Busan. The smell of boiled barley in a cracked teacup. My sister's humming, off-key, always the same lullaby. The first time I was called something less than human. The first time someone called me by my name again. She left the page unsigned, but the others knew it was hers. Each day afterward, the notebook grew. Sayeko wrote about her mother's hand-woven apron and how she had once stitched a secret pocket for coins and dried persimmons. Aiko, reluctant at first, contributed only 3 lines. "We burned the piano when the soldiers came." I didn't cry. I mourned it later, when no one was looking. Even Margaret began writing. Recipes, yes, but also moments. She wrote about her brother's habit of toasting bread on a shovel in winter. About the way the Manila air smelled like gunpowder and rain. About the moment she realized the war had made her afraid of silence. And how the kitchen gave that silence a home again. One afternoon, a visiting chaplain entered the kitchen, curious about the scent. He asked what was cooking. Aiko answered him directly, without looking up. "Repentance, and something like bread." The chaplain blinked. Sister Alma laughed. After that, the kitchen changed again. Other women, not just those tied to the comfort stations, began stopping by. Filipino mothers displaced by the shelling. 2 widows from Luzon who had lost sons in the Japanese retreat. Even a young American nurse who'd never seen combat, but had nightmares anyway. They came to taste. But more than that, they came to write. One entry, unsigned, read, "We were told to forget. That forgetting was victory. But I think remembering, without hatred, is harder and braver." The notebook became more than a recipe book. It became a reliquary, not for saints, but for survivors. Each smudge of butter, each ink blot, each page turned with a shaky hand. Proof that something sacred had been built with the simplest tools: bread, heat, and the courage to stay in the same room with the past. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret added a line at the bottom of a now-filled page. "We didn't make peace, but we made food. And maybe that's where peace begins." She closed the book, pressed her palm gently against the worn cover. Outside, the wind stirred the dust, but inside, the griddle still held heat, and for once, no one wanted to leave. But time does not wait for healing to be complete. By April 1945, orders came down from above. The detention center would be dismantled. The women, those not charged formally, were to be relocated to separate civilian housing under military oversight until post-war tribunals in Tokyo could determine the fates of each administrative category. Some would be deported, some interviewed further, others forgotten. The kitchen would be shut down. Margaret read the orders in the dim light of the mess tent, the typewriter ink still wet. Her hands tightened around the page. It felt like betrayal. Not because she thought justice had no place, but because she knew it had arrived too late, too cold, too blind. She didn't tell the women right away. Instead, she waited until after the last evening meal, after the last sandwich had been served. Toasted too dark by accident. Laughter exchanged over burnt crusts. She waited until the griddle was clean, and the women sat in the doorway, watching the sunset bloom over Manila's ruined skyline, gold over ash. Then, quietly, she said, "They're moving you." No one spoke, not even Aiko. Then Psycho, without looking away from the horizon, asked, "How long do we have?" 2 days, Margaret said. Minji stood, not abruptly, just slowly, like something ancient rising from the floorboards. She walked to the shelf, took the notebook, and returned to the center of the room. "I want to leave this," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Margaret stepped forward. "You don't have to," but Minji shook her head. "No, not for me. For those who come later." Then she handed the book to Sister Alma, who cradled it like it was something breakable, and perhaps it was. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She wandered the courtyard, past the rusted swing frame, the chapel wall now home to wild vines. She ended up in the kitchen, barefoot, where the moonlight made the counters glow like the surface of still water. The griddle was cold, but she lit the stove one last time, not to cook, just to feel it, to remind herself that warmth, once made, does not disappear. It lingers in metal, in hands, in stories passed between strangers who stop being strangers. By morning, the trucks had arrived. The women packed light. None of them had much to take. A scarf, a bar of soap, a folded picture, faded and worn. They lined up outside the chapel. No shackles, no guards with rifles raised. Just quiet wind and the sound of boots on gravel. Margaret stood beside Sister Alma. They watched the women step up into the back of the truck. One by one, Minji turned, bowed slightly. Aiko, defiant to the end, gave a half salute with a crooked smile. Psycho paused, looked Margaret in the eye, then said something that felt like a final breath. We remembered ourselves here, even the parts we didn't want back. And then she climbed aboard. The engine rumbled, and they were gone. Only the griddle remained, and the notebook, now resting beneath the chapel cross, wrapped in cloth like scripture. Months later, long after Margaret had transferred north, the war ended. The trials began. The headlines were printed in every language. Some names were read aloud in court. Others, like Minji, Seiko, Aiko, were not. But the stories lived elsewhere. Decades passed. Buildings rose and fell. The Jesuit seminary was rebuilt, its kitchens modernized, its walls painted clean and white. But one room, tucked near the back, still held an iron griddle, unused but not discarded. And above it, in a glass case, sat a small, grease-stained notebook. Visitors sometimes asked why it was there. The staff would explain. During the war, this was a kitchen, and someone wrote down stories in the margins of recipes. We kept them, and if someone was curious enough to open it, they might find a single final page written in Margaret's hand. It read, "This is not history. This is heat remembered. This is what happens when the guilty cook for the broken, and both become human again. This is a grilled cheese sandwich made without hatred, served with silence, eaten with eyes open." Then, beneath that, one last line, uncentered, almost hidden. She said it wasn't food, but she finished the whole thing. And if you listen closely, some say, just as you close the book, you might hear it. The soft hiss of butter on iron, the laughter of someone who never thought she'd laugh again, and the silence that no longer needs to be feared.